Please open your New Testament to the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John, John chapter 4. And tonight we will begin our study of what is oftentimes, or of who, I guess I should say, is oftentimes referred to as the woman at the well. John chapter 4 and the woman at the well. Jesus had just completed an interview with Nicodemus in chapter 3, and then we find John the Immerser being interrogated by the Jews of Jerusalem with respect to his opinion of Jesus. Once again, he'd already told them once what he thought about Christ, and now he is being interviewed again. I think they thought they would make him jealous by telling him that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John himself was. But John makes it clear, he must increase and I must decrease. What a great thing to say. The humility of John is outstanding, and we would do well to imitate it. Now, chapter 4 opens with that fact that Jesus is making and baptizing disciples. It says, when therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself baptized not but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again unto Galilee. And he must needs go through Samaria. Then cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. So Jesus left and came into Samaria. Samaria. The text says that Jesus must needs go into Samaria. And if one is not familiar with the geography or the travel patterns of the Jews in the first century, one might think, well, that's the way you have to go. But that's not the way you have to go. As a matter of fact, most of the Jews would come down from Jerusalem, and I say down because Jerusalem was in the hills, come down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and then go out onto the wilderness plain and cross the Jordan there, and then come up the easternmost side of the Jordan River into Decapolis, and then cross back over again the Jordan River and enter into Galilee in that way. The reason for this was because the Jews did not want to be contaminated by the Samaritans, even by passing through their land. Most often, the trip from Galilee to Jerusalem was accomplished during the time of a festival or a feast. So 3 times in a year, that track would be followed by Jews from the north going south to keep either Passover or Pentecost or Tabernacles. And one of the things they certainly wanted to do was remain ritually clean. And so they would not want to pass through Samaria because they regarded the Samaritans as being unclean. We'll see that here in a moment when we read what the Samaritan woman says. So Jesus, if he were following custom and ordinary practice, would not have passed through Samaria. So there's some reason why he went this way. And I think we could consider several possibilities. The fact that the Jews are holding Jesus in less and less favor is a good one. John does not exactly tell us when the baptizer was arrested. We learned in chapter 3 there, about verse 24, that he was not yet shut up in prison. But in comparing John to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, particularly Matthew chapter 4, it seems that this must be about the time that John is cast into prison. They have this interview with him. He is down in the Decapolis area himself, and so great multitudes are joining him, and so Jesus may very well have had to pass through where John was to get home, and so he chose to go another way. So he's probably seeking to avoid the multitudes. Everywhere Jesus went, there was a crowd that attracted themselves to him. And his lack of popularity at this time, or his decreasing popularity, perhaps is one reason why he's seeking to go through Samaria. Another possibility is the fact that this would just be safer for him. In other words, he doesn't want to attract these crowds, and he doesn't want to be where the Jews are going to be, these institutional Jews. And so this may be something that has to do with the fact that his hour is not yet come. When we get over into chapter 7, we'll see that Jesus' popularity has certainly decreased to the point that he is concerned about going up to Jerusalem at all, and does so in secret. So not only is he seeking to avoid the crowds, to avoid the attention, but it may be very well for his own safety. But the fact that verse 4 says there that he must needs go through Samaria. Turn back to chapter 3 and verse 14. And listen to what John says. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. That's our same word that's translated needs. Jesus must go through Samaria. And so perhaps the reason that Jesus is going through Samaria has nothing to do with his avoiding popularity, has nothing to do, or avoiding crowds because of his popularity, has nothing to do with the fact that he's trying to avoid the Jews for a matter of safety, but has everything to do with the fact that he needs to go to Samaria to do something that is important relative to his work as the Messiah. Jesus, when he gives the limited commission to the 12, tells them there in Matthew 10 and the parallels not to go into the way of the Samaritans or the Gentiles. They're not to go where the Gentiles are. They're not to go to the Samaritans. Yet here we find Jesus going into Samaria, to the city of Sychar or Shechem, and seeking out this woman to speak with her. However, in the Great Commission, when Jesus gives them the marching orders for preaching the gospel, he says, beginning in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and the uttermost parts of the earth. I don't think we can possibly fathom or imagine the popularity that Jesus had in the early years of his ministry. How the people flocked to him. And when he was in Decapolis, they came out of Phoenicia, and they came out of Decapolis, and they came out of Samaria, and they came out of Judea. These people just continually coming to Jesus. And Jesus interacted with Samaritans on more than this one occasion. Remember, he healed the Samaritan leper. And he talks about the good Samaritan. So Jesus is favorably disposed toward the Samaritans. He's not prejudiced against them. He understands that they are included in God's plan, and he wants to save them. So when we read that he must needs go to Samaria, this may very well should be interpreted as something that Jesus needed to do in order to prepare the Samaritans for himself. And when we see Jesus in Samaria, it's a very fortuitous occasion, as we are going to be studying together, because later, Luke chapter 9, we'll see that he went through Samaria and they wanted to stone him. And you'll remember that James and John, whom Jesus called the sons of thunder, they said, well, shall we call fire down on this village? And Jesus said, you don't know what spirit you are. So just like with the Jews, so it was with the Samaritans. Not everyone wanted to receive Christ. Not everyone was open to what Jesus might have to say. Some of them were prejudiced and dismissed him immediately just simply because he was a Jew going to Jerusalem. They didn't want to have anything to do with him, just like Jews didn't want to have anything to do with the Samaritans. And so all the Samaritans are not free of prejudice. All of the Samaritans are not like this woman. And frankly, this woman had her prejudices, as we're going to see. But Jesus is, I think, really here preparing the ground. Jesus is making preparations. Later, Philip will go into Samaria, the city itself of Samaria, and preach the gospel. And what is the result? There's great joy in that city. A lot of people obeyed Christ, and a lot of people became Christians. And then later we'll see when after the events there in Antioch, which are recorded in Acts chapter 15, that when the church at Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas up to Jerusalem, that they went through Samaria and Phoenicia, which would have been these Gentile and Samaritan regions, and they were received with great joy. So there'd been a lot of preaching in Samaria in the first century, and a lot of folks obeyed the gospel. And so I think it's directly related to what Jesus does here with this woman at the well. Now, this place where Jesus stopped is called, in most of the versions, Sychar. And most of the scholars today have concluded that this is the little city of Shechem, which where a great many things happened in the Old Testament related to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this is where they began to settle, and this is where they began their pilgrimage in the land. This is where Jacob came after he had been in Padan Aram for all those years, working for Leah and working for Rachel. And so he comes home from Padan Aram, and he comes back to Shechem, and that's where he settles. And so this is the parcel of ground to which they're referring. This is the parcel of ground that was given to the Ephraimites as a part of their possession in the promised land, because they were the descendants of Joseph. God gave it to Joseph, and Joseph gave it to his sons. And so this is where Joseph was even buried near here. Remember how that when the children of Israel were in Egyptian bondage, and Joseph died at the age of 110, and he said, "Take my body with you back into the land of Canaan when you go back." He says, God's going to take you back and take my body with you. And they did that. Joseph was mummified according to the burial rituals of the Egyptians, and they carried his body all the way back to the promised land. And this is where he was buried, not very far from this place. But anyway, Jacob had dug a well there, and that well is still there today. It's not like it was in ancient times, but it's a hole in the ground about 75 feet deep, and it's lined with tile, and it has water in it even to this day. And they've built a shrine over it, and they've built a church over it, and so it's very much a tourist thing now in the Middle East. It's thought to have been at one time at least over 100 feet deep, maybe as much as 150 feet deep. And you think about digging a well with a shovel for 150 feet, that's a pretty good load of work. And this well, at one point, because this is still the case, it has an artesian feature. You know, the two things about a well: you can dig one and you can hit water and it bubbles up, and that's great. That's what you want. Or it becomes a cistern. That is, it just holds water. And so the rainwater perks down into the ground and then eventually comes into this cistern that you've dug. You go down to the rock and it'll hold the water. It won't perk any further. And so it'll percolate so far down and catch the water. And so Jacob's well has the feature of being both an artesian well or a flowing well, as well as a well that acts as a cistern. And like I said, it's there today, and you can see it. And it's perhaps the most, of all the sites in Israel, it is perhaps the most certain of those that they believe this is indeed Jacob's well. So it's an incredible thing that well has been in existence all of this time. And so Jesus comes to Sychar, or Shechem, into that parcel of ground that God gave to Jacob, where Joseph was later buried, and he sits down on the edge of the well. And Most of the wells today that we think of are enclosed and they have a pump on them or something like that. And so the idea of an open well is kind of foreign to most of us today, but the idea of being able to let a container down into the well and to draw, that's what this woman is talking about. When she says, I come here to draw, she has to lower her pot. Just think of that. Tie a rope to it and lower it down all this way, 70, maybe even more feet at sometimes, in order to draw water. And so verse 6 says that Jacob's well was there, and he, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour of the day. And following Jewish time, that's noon. The 3rd hour is 9. If the day begins at 6 in the morning, and I'm talking about the day portion of the day, the daylight 12 hours, so 6 o'clock is the beginning, 3rd hour would be 9 o'clock, and straight up noon would be the 6th hour. And so this is where we are, the hottest part of the day, and Jesus comes and he sits on this well. And verse 8 says that his disciples were gone into the city to buy meat or to buy food. And so it's lunchtime. Here they are at this well, a logical place to stop. It's a roadside park, let's think of it that way. They can sit there, they can enjoy cool water, and they're going to go into town and bring some food back, and they'll all take their meal, and then they'll proceed on their journey. And so while they're in town, this woman comes at noon to draw water, and Jesus is sitting there, and he says, give me to drink. And that kind of startles the woman. She said to him, verse 9, how is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? And either that's parenthetically supplied by John, or she just goes on and says it herself. It doesn't make any difference to me. For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. She's startled by this fact. Now, how did she know he was a Jew? Well, again, we got to remember a few things. The Jewish men didn't cut the corners of their beards. They didn't trim their beards. And so you've seen these Hasidic Jews with these long curls down the side of their face. Jesus would have had an untrimmed beard. And he would have been wearing the traditional garments of the Jews, which included a shawl generally that had blue fringe around its edges. And this would have been something that the men wore in particular, so that they could be reminded that they were of the special people of God. And so he would have been dressed very much like a Jewish man would have been dressed. And she recognized him as a Jew. And she's startled to see him here in the middle of Samaria, sitting at this well. And then above all things else, to ask Jesus, for Jesus to ask her, give me a drink of water. Well, why? Well, she's got a bucket and he doesn't. She has something with which to draw. It's called a water pot in verse 27, I believe it is, or 28. She left her water pot, so she had a water pot. She's obviously going to draw water, and Jesus is thirsty. He says, give me a drink. And she says what she does to him, rather put off by the fact that he asked. But Jesus' technique here is very good. He's open. He's friendly. He's obviously not prejudiced against her. And her response, though it's kind of short and maybe we might think impolite, it doesn't receive the same kind of retort that she gave. And so Jesus just simply says, and he's always looking for an opportunity to teach people, and this is why he's there, to teach someone, and she's the one. And Jesus says, well, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that says unto you, give me to drink, you would have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. If you'd known the gift of God, not God as a gift, but a gift which God gives, and you knew who it was that asked you for a drink. So clearly here, Jesus is the giver, And this gift of God is what he's going to give. You would have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. And so the gift of God is this living water. And again, Jesus is speaking cryptically, because living water is a phrase that would be used to describe an artesian well. Running water, fresh water, water that's bubbling up out of the ground. I don't know if you have these around here in this part of the country. I would suspect that you do. I sold a piece of land a couple of years ago over around Mount Enterprise that had an artesian well on it, just bubbling up out of the ground and just making a little stream all the way across the property. Really a nice feature. And so sometimes the water just bubbles up out of the ground. And that's incredible that could be the case. And so living water. And when she knew there wasn't anything like that around there, that well was deep. That well was 75, 100, maybe 150 feet deep. And he's talking about living water. So she's perplexed, and rightly so. But sometimes by asking a question and speaking in precise but not necessarily clear terms, gets people's attention. And so here's Jesus, the master teacher, and he's got her attention because she says, and I'll have to admit it's not very pleasant what she says, or kind, or the kind of thing that you would expect, because she basically says, "Are you crazy?" She says, "Sir, you don't have anything to draw with. You don't have a bucket. You don't have a gourd. You don't have anything to draw with. And the well is deep. You don't have a shovel. There's no artesian well here. And so the only way there's any water coming up out of the ground, you've got to dig down there and get to it. So you don't have a bucket and you don't have a shovel. Where in the world are you going to get this living water?" And so she's kind of sarcastic in her reply. And then she goes to the next step. She says, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank thereof himself and his children and his cattle?" And that's a rhetorical question. She didn't expect an answer, but had Jesus answered it truthfully, he would have said yes. See, she's leading herself where Jesus wants her to go. Well, as a matter of fact, I am greater than Jacob. But he doesn't say that. He's going to let her come to that conclusion. But Jesus goes on and he takes this a little bit further. And he says, "Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again." Now, this ought to be the first clue that she has that Jesus is not talking about literal water. The water that's in this well, you'll be thirsty at some point. That's the way it is with anything. And I think that's one of the reasons why God has made us like we are. So that after the transgression and we are in the material realm, what we learn is that there's nothing that satisfies. Nothing. You're hungry, you go eat. We went last night and ate some really good fish. It's delicious. But you know what? I got up this morning and had a bowl of cereal. As good as that fish was, I had a bowl of cereal this morning. And then I had baked potato and some more fish at lunch. So the fish didn't satisfy, and the cereal didn't satisfy, and the fish I had at lunch didn't satisfy, because I'm going to probably have a sandwich here after a little bit. That's the way it is in this world. Nothing satisfies. A fellow makes a living. He wants to make money. What does a guy who has a lot of money want? Usually he wants more money. Money doesn't satisfy. Food doesn't satisfy. Water doesn't satisfy. There's not anything that really satisfies. And that's the way God made us, so we would learn that this world is not my home. Jesus is offering her something that will satisfy her, will meet every yearning that she could possibly ever have. And so in verse 14, he goes on and says, "Whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water, springing up into everlasting life. And now he's got her attention. But Jesus is not talking about literal water, but she's not at the point yet where Jesus wants her to be. Because notice what she says. Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. She's still in the material dimension. You ever talk to somebody like that? You want to talk to them about spiritual things, but you can never get them out of the material dimension. They only think in terms of what's around them. You start talking to them about the gospel, and they immediately start talking about their marriage or their family or how this is going to affect their job, and just on and on and on and on. And they weren't listening, because you said, I'm going to give you something to drink that you're never going to be thirsty again. I'm going to give you something to eat. You'll never be hungry again. I'm going to give you something that's going to satisfy every longing that you've ever had. And when it's all said and done, you're going to live forever. You're not listening. All she could think of is, boy, I won't have to carry this water pot anymore. I won't have to walk that mile and a half, whatever it was, from her house out there to the well and let that pot all the way down into the bottom. And that's the easy part, letting it down, and then pull it all the way back up. How many times in a day did she have to do that? You know, when I went to Ethiopia, I'd been a lot of places, but I'd never been any place quite like Ethiopia. When I went to Central America, most of the people had a well, and the government supplied most of that in a lot of places. And so the little houses, they had a well, and they might have an outdoor facility, but it was such that they could keep it clean and wash and had running water and so forth. And so it's a pretty good thing. And we lived in a little place that had running water inside. It had a cistern up on the roof that caught the water and then gravity and so forth. And in the morning, you didn't want to take a shower in the morning. You really didn't want to take one in the afternoon, because it still hadn't had time to warm up, but it was better than it was in the morning. But you had water that could be used like that. And then when I went to the Philippines, most of the people lived in houses that had running water. There are parts of the country that didn't have running water, but where we were had running water. But when you get to Ethiopia, at least we were traveling more, and that may be the reason why I saw this. There was this ubiquitous yellow can, plastic. Looked like a 5-gallon gasoline can. It was yellow. I mean yellow. And you'd see these little kids walking up down the road with these cans. And one day we got behind this fella driving a donkey cart. We're on the highway, and he's driving this donkey cart. And it's just stacked up 3, 4, 5 levels high with these yellow cans. And I said, Randy, what are they doing? He said, today's the day to get water. I said, what? And we drove a little further into the town, and there was this long line with these kids and these women holding these buckets, and these fellas with these donkey carts passing them up to get them filled. And so they were filling these cans with water. Now, just imagine if you had to carry 2 5-gallon cans, and where we'd seen these people a mile or two down the road. And here they are walking to the one place where you've got a spigot coming up out of the ground and water running out of it. And that's their big chore for the day, to fill up their water can. I can understand why she's excited about the probability or possibility of never having to go back and draw water. You know, we don't realize how good we've got it sometimes. And so let's not be too hard on the woman, because this was something that was taking up an incredible part of her day and required a lot of work and energy, and she had to haul this water, very likely on her shoulder or maybe even on her head. I saw women in Ethiopia carrying those yellow cans on their head. I think, man, 5 gallons of water on your head? She said, give me this water so I never thirst and never have to come back here and draw. And so what Jesus said just kind of went right over her head, didn't it? Water that will give you everlasting life. I am come from God to give you living water, which will satisfy every yearning that you have. And as a result of that, you shall never die. And she's worried about yellow cans and water. But she's ready. And Jesus just abruptly changes the subject, but he's not really changing the subject at all. Jesus said to her, go and call your husband and come hither. Now, where did that come from? They hadn't been talking about family. That's kind of a personal thing anyway, you know. She hadn't said she was married or not married, had family or whatever. And Jesus said, go and call your husband and come here. And the woman said to Jesus, I have no husband. And here's where the change-up comes. Jesus says, thou hast well said, I have no husband. For thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou hast now is not thy husband, in that thou saidst that truth. Wow. Jesus is getting personal. You're right. You're an adulteress. You're living with a man without benefit of marriage, and he's not the first one. You've had 5 that you called husbands. And really that shouldn't be so startling, because we live in a time and age where people just disregard marriage altogether. It's not uncommon even today to hear of someone who's had 4 or 5 husbands, or they're living with someone who's not their husband or their wife, and a lot of other things that people do. And Jesus is not saying this to embarrass her. He just states a fact. You've told the truth. You don't have a husband. You've had 5, and the one you've got now is not your husband. Whether he meant that she wasn't his by right, which was the problem that John the Baptist had identified with Herod and Philip's wife, or he meant that you've just given up on the idea of marriage altogether, and now you're just living with whoever will let you live with them. And in response to that, and this shows you that the woman got it, at least he's got her attention, the woman says, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. When she goes and tells the men of the city, there in verse 29, she says, come see a man which told me all things that ever I did. Jesus is a Jewish man, complete and total stranger to her. He's never been seen in this community. There's absolutely no reason in the world to believe that he knows anything about her or anybody in the community. And Jesus reveals to her the most intimate details of her life. And the logical conclusion for her is, sir, you must be a prophet. When Jesus came to Simon's house, the Pharisee, and the woman came in and she wept over Jesus' feet, and she anointed him with oil, and she dried his feet with the hair of her head. Simon in his heart said, well, this man cannot be a prophet, because if he were a prophet, he would know what manner of woman this was. Now, Simon may be a little bit off the wall there, because a prophet didn't just have immediate access to the identities of people. It would have had to have been a revelation. But he's not wrong in saying, well, there's a reason why he should have known who she was, because he did possess a gift and could perhaps discern this if he was concerned about it as much as I am, being clean or unclean. You see, there's the problem with Simon. But the point is that it was expected of a prophet to be able to discern things that were not ordinarily revealed about people. And Jesus does this on more than one occasion. And so she's reaching the right conclusion. She said, sir, I perceive that you are a prophet, and now she's ready to listen. She still doesn't know who he is beyond the fact that he's a prophet. This is very much like what we'll see in John chapter 9 when Jesus heals the blind man. And they asked him, who did this for you? And he said, well, Jesus. And well, who is he? Well, he's a prophet. Says, what do you mean he's a prophet? He's violating the Sabbath. He's an evildoer. And he says, it's a funny thing to me that you think he's an evildoer. Who in the world ever heard of an evil man being able to open the eyes of one who was born blind? He concluded that this man was a prophet. He's someone sent from God. That was Nicodemus' conclusion. Sir, we perceive that you are a teacher come from God, because no man can do the things that you do except God be with him. This is not an unreasonable conclusion. The evidence is all in favor of it. And so she says, sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. And immediately now her attention is turned to spiritual things. And so she says, our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is a place where men ought to worship. And while Jesus has got her in the right place of all the questions to ask, why would you ask that? Have you ever studied or tried to get a Bible study with someone saying, let's study the Bible? I said, I've always wanted to study the book of Revelation. They don't know Genesis from Revelation. Generations from revolution, as one fellow used to say. They don't know anything about the Bible, and the one book they want to study is the most difficult book there is. And that's kind of what this lady does here. She asks a question about something that troubles her. It's a theological question. It's an important issue of the day, but it's not the most pressing thing that she needs to ask about. And so Jesus goes on to answer it, and we're going to come back to these verses next week and study them in detail. But Jesus says, woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor at Jerusalem worship the Father. Ye worship you know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And what I want you to see at this point in our study tonight is that Jesus takes that question and he answers it. He doesn't dismiss it. He doesn't wave his hand over and say, oh, that's stupid. You need to be asking this. No, Jesus asks this. He turns it around and he says, let me tell you, the Jews are right on that one. But really, that's not important. Here's what's important. And he says, there's an hour coming, and that now is. And the woman, she got some of it because she said, well, I know that the Messiah comes, which is called Christ. Now, just think what Jesus has done. He's gotten this woman from a place where he thought he was talking about water to wrestling about theological questions that existed between people who were religiously divided, to finally getting her to the place where she asked the most important question in the world. Well, I know that Messiah is coming. And that's where he wanted her. He wanted her thinking about Messiah. And Jesus says, I that speak unto thee am he. I perceive that you're a prophet. She was in a place where she was ready to receive what Jesus said. Sometimes that's what we have to do. We have to get our bona fides in order to be able to teach people something. I did call-in radio for a long time, and a lot of questions were asked that really weren't that important. One time a fellow called in and says, I've heard all my life about that great speckled bird in the Bible. Says, what is that? My partner with me that day says, well, I'm not exactly sure, but Roy Acuff sure does sing about him a lot. And that kind of broke things up, and we got a chuckle out of it. And then we looked up the passage. It's in the book of Jeremiah. You look it up, and we talked about it a little while. And then we talked about what we really needed to be talking about, which was Jesus Christ. See? And that's the thing about people ask all kinds of questions. And when I study with the young preachers, I used to do that a lot, I would tell them, I said, if you can't get from A to Jesus, you're not doing your work. Heard a preacher say one time, well, you know, ever thought that an invitation just ruined a good sermon? And I wanted to slap the fella, but of course I didn't. No, an invitation doesn't ruin a good sermon. It wasn't a very good sermon if you didn't have it where you could get to an invitation. If you can't preach from the Bible and talk about Jesus and exalt Jesus and show people that they need Jesus, your preaching is not what it ought to be. Every time we get up and stand behind this pulpit, we need to be trying to get people to see Jesus, to hear Jesus, to obey Jesus. See? And that's what I see the Lord doing here. He's taking this woman from a place where she's really pretty carnal and she doesn't understand things till he finally gets her attention and she recognizes, well, this fella knows what he's talking about. He's a prophet. And so she asked a question that troubled her. It was important to her, whether it was important to anybody else or not. It was important to her. And Jesus said, well, the Jews are right on that, but let me tell you something. That's not the most critical thing that you need to be concerned about. Because even though the Jews are right on it and the Samaritans are wrong, the reality is that's not going to matter anymore, because now's the time for spirit and truth. Jesus is announcing a new covenant to her. And she says, well, I know that when Messiah comes, he'll tell us all things. She understood there was going to be a renewal. There was going to be a beginning again with the kingdom of heaven. And she says, I know that's coming. And Jesus said, I'm he. I'm he. And so about that time, the disciples get back. And I love verse 28 because it tells the whole story. The woman left her water pot and went her way. Water wasn't important anymore, was it? She didn't fill her pot and take it with her. She left it out. She'd walked all the way from town out there to get water, and she didn't get any, and she left her pot, and she went all the way back into town, and she's talking about Jesus. That's what we're trying to do in teaching people. Next week, we're going to talk about spirit and truth and what it means to worship in spirit and truth, and then we'll take another lesson and finish out chapter 4. You've been very attentive tonight, and I thank you.